So we have 128 people who've joined us so far, 130, 32.
Wow.
So it's growing.
Good.
So we have somebody from Spain who said hello.
Hi.
Hola. Wait, thank you. Hola.
Hola. So there are about 150 people now.
So cool.
Yeah. So we have somebody from Kaur. All right. So it's 3:30 and we'll start. Namaste.
Hi.
And hello, everybody.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us today on our panel discussion. The topic is wildlife tourism in India. I have with me a very eminent panel today for this discussion. People directly connected and on ground in the jungles of India. So please excuse us for any connectivity issues today, as we have our panelists from across India and also France. Eric De Cana is in Kanha, Sharad Vats is in Delhi, Bhavna is in Mumbai, and Surya Ramachandran is in Masinaguri in Nilgiris, and Jean-Noël Estive is in France. So just to introduce you, our panel today, Sharad, raise your hand, Sharad, and say hello to everybody.
Hi, guys.
Okay,
Hello.
so Sharad is a passionate wildlife photographer and naturalist. He has worked with the Taj Group of Hotels for 11 years and started Nature Safari India in 2000 as a wildlife resort marketing company and an inbound wildlife DMC in 2006. He built his own lodge in Kanha, which was ranked amongst the top 25 small hotels in India for 2 years. He sold it in 2016, and wildlife is his life, as he says. Then we have Eric De Cana. Eric, raise your hand. Let people see you.
Good afternoon.
Eric is in Kanha, in the jungles of Kanha. He started his career at the Bombay Natural History Society as a research assistant, and he spent time studying the highly endangered Great Indian Bustard and the black-necked cranes as a field biologist. He's a published author and has to his credit a checklist of the birds of Kanha, published in 1998. It is still regarded as the go-to reference guide for researchers and birders alike. He has spent over 3 decades of his life at Kanha and is currently the general manager of an 8-room boutique lodge, Bagh Tolha, at Kanha National Park. Then we have Surya. Surya, say hello to everybody.
Hello, everyone.
Raise your hand. Surya is in Nilgiris in the south right now. He started his vocation as an engineer, but later switched careers to pursue his passion for nature and wildlife. His journey commenced in the forests of Satpura National Park and Tiger Reserve, where he began as an intern, eventually becoming a full-time naturalist. At Satpura, Surya pioneered Central India's first walking safari, as well as canoeing, wilderness camping, and night drives. He has written a book, a photo field guide to Central India. The comprehensive volume covers 850 species in the region, a first of its kind field guide in India. Surya is also well versed in the wildlife of Africa and the elusive snow leopard in the Himalayas, where he has been leading tours for many years now. We have Bhavna Menon. Bhavna, say hello to the panel and everybody, all our audience. Bhavna is Bhavna is a program manager with Last Wilderness Foundation. It's an NGO working towards wildlife conservation and has a particular affinity for leopards. The Last Wilderness Foundation, established in 2009, works towards conservation outreach, focusing primarily on human-wildlife conflict, capacity building with the Forest Department frontline staff, and creation of livelihood opportunities for communities that live around the tiger reserves at Kanha, Bandhavgarh, and Panna, tiger reserves of Madhya Pradesh, in tandem with the Forest Department. So her perspective on the whole thing would be very interesting. Last but not the least, we have Jean-Noël Estif. He is our product manager. He's based in Paris right now. He is a product manager at the Destination Knowledge Center with the company, and he travels all over the Indian subcontinent to keep us abreast of the latest developments in the tourism sphere, including hotels and his take on the infrastructure of the various destinations. He's passionate about wildlife and India. As I said, at present, he's sitting in Paris. So guys, we have a panel from all over, and please bear with us. Technology can sometimes play havoc in small cities. So let's see how we go. I'm starting now. Wildlife tourism has always been small and niche in India. Also, it is invariably always associated with the Royal Bengal tiger that tourists don't see in Africa. In the same breath, I would also say that it has been more for the discerning and evolved traveler. And recently I've been reading up and all the trends that are coming in for when things open up. Rural tourism, standalone properties in the lap of nature, wilderness, mindfulness, sustainability are some of the buzzwords going around and are going to be important in the travelers' minds and aspirations. Do you think this could be an opportunity for India to give a boost to its wildlife tourism, take it to a larger audience, and also expose and showcase that there is flora and fauna and a whole new world beyond the tiger in our jungles? So I'd like to talk about opportunities, and let me ask you first, Sharad. Sharad, you have run a commercial enterprise.
Yeah.
Do you think wildlife tourism will pick up better when this is all over?
I think it'll be a bit slow to begin with. Initially, the wildlife tourism will have to sustain, or will just the domestic tourism will actually start off. But gradually, as there are some signs of the vaccine which will come in, I think it'll start shaping up. So definitely there is an opportunity. It will pick up. If all goes well, I think by March in 2021, we should be coming back into a form, and 2022 will be normal unless we have another outbreak or anything else, some new virus. Opportunity, yes. I think we need to mend our itineraries a bit. We need to look at how for, in some programs, maybe can we avoid the airports? Can we avoid the airlines? Can we do more driving holidays? Bigger car, lesser people. So, and again, as you said, that national parks are not so densely populated. So there isn't too much of contact. There is as such sufficient social distancing. The lodges are small and boutique, just like the one even of Eric. So there are several opportunities there, and people will feel far more safer when they're in wildlife compared to going and seeing the Taj Mahal, where suddenly you might have a couple of hundred people, or Amer Fort, or somewhere else. So once you are doing a safari, you are maximum 2-3 people within your vehicle. Quite okay. And if it's just your family, even better. So ideally avoid larger groups, focus more on FITs to begin with, and then gradually I think the groups can also follow.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for that insight, Sharad. Bhavna, yes. You have worked closely with a few tribal communities in your endeavor of wildlife conservation. Yes. In the time that you spent with the Baiga and other tribal communities in central India, what are the opportunities that you see in today's scenario?
With regard to tourism?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So we've already started a few initiatives. So the whole idea was to build a dialogue with the community members and to get more and more people to visit villages, because it was very shocking once when there was a tourist who came to me and said there are villages beyond the tiger as well. I said, yeah, these tiger reserves all have villages around them, and the fact that they were unaware really disappointed me. So what we wanted to do was to get more and more people to visit villages, to visit community members. So we have started some initiatives in the area I work. In Kanha, we started the Bega village walk. So people can go for a walk in the village. They can sit and make the traditional jewelry with the Begas. In Panna, they can go for a walk in the wilderness with the Pardis, who were a traditional hunting community with brilliant knowledge of the forest and of animal calls and of plants and medicinal herbs. So they can do that. And in Bandhavgarh also, we have a lunch and dinner with the villagers, where people can go and share their experiences and gain some experiences from the community members as well. The whole idea is to break ice and for people to earn a livelihood from this as well.
I have a follow-up question on this, but I'll ask you later. It's to do with sustainability. So
Sure.
We'll hold that thought. But I'd like to go to Eric now. Eric, I've seen you employ local tribals as birders because they can mimic almost any bird. In fact, you introduced me to birding, and I owe you for that. I don't know if you remember the first time I ever went to a jungle was with you. Now, India is home to some of the most exotic avian species and also plays host to many annual migratory species. What can we do as tourism professionals to promote birding in India?
Thank you, Lovelin, and a very good afternoon to all the members who have joined. See, now, fortunately or unfortunately, wildlife tourism in India, to a large extent, it was promoted mainly as tiger tourism. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Eric.
Yeah, okay. Now, there are several places in India which are amazing birding destinations, and we have so many species which are endemic. For example, the Northeast is a treasure trove. I mean, and also the Southwest, the Western Ghats. Unfortunately, we don't have endemic species in Central Indian tiger parks. I mean, most of them are either resident birds or just the passage migrants. But yes, there are amazing birding destinations, and some of them, as I told you earlier, they are just endemic species. You see them only in India, nowhere else in the world. And even Andaman and Nicobar Islands, they have some endemic species. So it's all up to us, the industry, how we are going to highlight these things. And I'm sure there are several people who will be interested, or rather, there are so many people who love birding, recording several species. Sometimes they record first timers in their life. So there is an amazing scope. But the problem is, we have been promoting most of our well-known parks only as tiger destinations. Of course, the tiger sighting is pretty good there, and that's why people come. There's no denying. But even in Kanha, there are so many birds. I mean, sometimes when we just switch off the engine and just wait, listen to the bird calls and try to figure out which bird was making that call, or try to show them to our guests, and that's when the tiger has come out of the bush and started walking on the road. So yeah. And also, yes, I have employed several local boys from the local villages, and let me tell you, they may not be very highly educated, but their skills and their eyesight and their ability to recognize a bird call, they have their own nomenclature, but they are outstanding. You just need to train them a little bit, and you can use them as excellent trackers or bird guides.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, yeah. So, do you think the TMCs need to make more effort, or tour operators need to make more effort towards promoting
Yes, certainly. Now, the first thing in this effort is to doing a proper recce, identifying, shortlisting all those places where they can take. Once again, I would like to highlight that whenever we do these birding trips, they have to be small groups who are prepared to walk through these birding trails. And there are some amazing birding trails in South India, and I'm sure in the Northeast, and could be a brilliant experience for many. First time experience.
Yeah. Good thoughts there. I'll now like to ask Surya, there is a bird chirping somewhere, or is it someone's phone ringtone? I don't know. Eric, do you recognize that bird that's making the racket?
I can't hear, unfortunately.
Okay.
Seems like someone's phone actually.
So, so somewhere behind the glamour of could be. Somewhere behind, Surya, I'm asking you a question. So somewhere behind the glamour of tiger conservation campaigns, the efforts to preserve the lesser known species go largely unnoticed. What are your thoughts on this, and where do you see an opportunity?
Laveen, generally how conservation works in more or less, this is the norm world over, is you try to have a symbol of conservation, which is your charismatic megafauna. In this case, we're talking about the tiger. For a place like Ladakh, it will be the snow leopard. For let's say Africa, it will be the lions and the big cats and the migration or anything like that. That's what you take, and what you do after that is where the whole forest comes into the attention of people, the attention of funders, the attention of scientists, and then the habitat is preserved. But having said that, if you look at, for example, Kaziranga, where all the attention is focused on the one-horned rhino's conservation, which is one of the greatest success stories of our country. But what happens there is, in the effort to protect the rhino, they do a lot of things which are focused in a way to conserve just the rhino, like the burning of the grasslands to make sure there's fresh grass available for them. And that affects other critically endangered species like the Bengal florican. There could be frogs, there could be insects, there could be all kinds of things which are getting affected because of what we are doing, which we think is good for one, but may not be good for other. So in general, conservation obviously has to start somewhere with something that people relate to or people are kind of get excited about. But beyond that, there has to be a plan of execution which involves the habitat as such and not just focused on species. We are still a long way from paying attention to everything. Like, for example, in the south, we have a critically endangered frog which lives only on 2 mountain peaks. For me, that would be the rarest thing, rarest living creature in our country. But who cares? I mean, right now, it is actually a pretty frog, but there are people are trying to fight for it. But the attention required, even that is a part of a national park where people talk about tigers and other megafauna like the Nilgiri Thar. But they, I feel, will last longer compared to these things. So we are still a long ways away. I'm not carpet bombing and saying it is going to be something that is affecting everywhere. People are doing good work in smaller scales, but that is more down to individual effort than government. There's no government will in protecting something as small or as let's say minuscule or as things that take less attention of the common man, and it doesn't make them look that good. That's where the government will help a lot for us.
Right. Right. So there is government, and of course, as private companies, we can do our bit a little bit and try and promote products and areas that are lesser known and obviously have huge opportunity there. So from all the discussion that we've had so far, from Sharad to Bhavna to Eric, everybody's spoken about a different aspect of wildlife tourism that could be an opportunity, whether it is engaging with the communities, with village walks, or introducing birding as something big, and small wildlife, as you spoke about the frog in the Kaziranga area. So, Jean, my next question is to you. How important a role do you think infrastructure plays in promoting wildlife sanctuaries and national parks? And what opportunity do you see when things open up?
I think hotels have a crucial, very, very important role to play, as much as the forest department and the local association on the spot. They have a major role to play in terms of sustainability, in terms of preservation of the environment, and in terms of promoting the local culture. Through activities, for instance, because resorts propose some activities apart from wildlife. So to promote activities such as walks, to see the local villages, and to create awareness to travelers regarding some of these unique culture would be extremely important to showcase a little more. Some of the hotels' efforts towards ecological conservation and community are seen in some concrete actions. So even if it would be better that all of them do it, in terms of preservation of the environment, even if none of the hotels are set in core zones, which is the very heart and the most fragile part of the national park, some of them are set in buffer zones. So it is extremely important for them to think about the preservation of the environment, which is done in lots of cases. I remember when I traveled there in the area in 2018, I was in Tadoba, and there were a resort which was the first one using battery-operated safari vehicle. Two of them being the first eco-friendly battery jeep used in India. So I think this is it was an excellent idea, which should be maybe it has been spread over more parks since then. But I think it is a very important point to showcase. Also to provide employment opportunities for the tribes so that they don't move to bigger cities. Some of these hotels are actively engaged in conservation and community development activities. So this is an extremely important part that resorts have to play. They are engaged. They have engaged actions such as minimizing environmental and ecological, maximizing social, cultural impact. And to name some of these concrete actions, there is, planning and designing the properties in a way that no single tree is moved, sensitive construction using natural light to be more energy efficient, local manpower, of course, saying total no to using one-time plastic at all levels, to name few of these actions. And what would be what next after this unique period, after confinement and post-coronavirus, would be simply to showcase in a deeper way all these actions which are set by the resorts, and of course also all the action of the local association and the forest department to promote national parks, wildlife, local culture in a more sustainable way. Because I already heard comments from some partners saying that they don't want obviously to promote too much wildlife safaris because for them it is not connected with, it is not eco-friendly. So apart from developing the use of these battery jeep, excuse me, it would be to create a worldwide promotional campaign showcasing all the action which are already done by all the people on the ground, which would be, I think, a big help.
Thank you. Taking a cue from Jean about sustainability, which according to me is an all-encompassing word, including not just environment, but also community, social and economic responsibility, etc. Eric, in a world where sustainability has become the buzzword and we are seeing an increase in the idea of conscious travel, where does the perfect balance between funds and footfall concerning wildlife conservation in India lay? How do you balance that over tourism doesn't happen and yet you're getting enough footfall to preserve the wildlife in a way? So what's on this?
Well,
Eric?
Loveleen, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, if you just look at the history of wildlife tourism in India, see, in the last 2 decades or so, most of the lodges, most of the accommodation that has come up around are well-known parks, whether it is Ranthambore or Kana, Bandhavgarh, Pench, Satpura, or even Tadoba. There has been a sudden spurt, in the tourism activity. And unfortunately, these parks have been highlighted and have been, promoted as best wildlife and tiger sighting destinations. And with the result, we have had too many people visiting. If you analyze what used to happen before 2012, before they started, restricting the number of visitors, creating zones, and the matter went to Supreme Court. 20% of the area was open. Only 20% of the area has been, reserved for tourism now. Now, I think we need to open up more places. Not just Kana. We can create several Kanas, several Bandhavgarhs. There is immense potential in the country. It's a challenge. There are several small, sanctuaries, and there are small, green spaces which need to be preserved. Now, how many people don't even know that, there are tigers beyond the boundaries of the national park. There are tigers in the regular reserve forest. Now, what we need to do is we need to identify, these places. Now, just to give you a small, success story of the Pen Sanctuary near Kana. It's a satellite sanctuary, and in the last 8 years, they moved the villagers from there. They just protected the sanctuary. They did not do any. The forest department did not create any magic, but the nature is capable of taking care of itself. You just protect a place, and within 5-6 years, the wildlife comes back. First, it is when you protect a green space, when you protect the habitat, first it is the herbivores which come, and then naturally, when the herbivores are there, there is a concentration of the herbivores. The predators follow, and that's how you create. You don't have to do any plantation. You don't have to do any, extra, translocation and all that. You just need to just have patience, protect a green space, and create more places so that people go to different areas. And also, we have got immense diversity in our flora and fauna. So we need to showcase these places. We have got grasslands, we have got marine national parks, we have got hills, we have got beautiful mangrove systems. So unfortunately, we have been highlighting only forests and, national parks, which have got big fauna. We need to diversify. We need to showcase the diversity that we have in the country. That's how I see it.
Yeah, well said, Eric. Now, my second part to that question is, what do you think defines a responsible encounter with animals in tourism? So when you have jeeploads of people going to see a tiger, what is a responsible encounter with an animal in tourism?
Well, now you all are aware perhaps that every Jeep has a local driver, a local lodge naturalist, and a guide. Now, the most important thing is you need to brief your guests before entering the park, and that is the responsibility of the lodge and the lodge naturalist before you take them into a sanctuary or a national park. You need to train them sufficiently, and when you see a tiger or when you see a leopard or when you see an elephant, I mean, you need to maintain the safe distance and also educate them not to create ruckus there, which invariably happens. And educating the tourists, I mean, there are several people who come repeatedly and they know how to behave, but also we get first timers or people, you know, in India, we get people with their children and families. So preparing them, having proper briefing before you take them into the national park is very important.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for that insight, Eric. Sharad, my next question is to you. You believe in promoting lesser known but equally beautiful national parks and reserves to give some respite to the celebrity parks, as you say. How prepared are these lesser known parks? And could you give us some examples of what you mean? Eric spoke on the same lines as opening up more spaces. So, do you have something identified? You know which places could be open, and what are the lesser known parks you think should be open? Sharad.
Sorry, I was muted. Okay. These lesser known parks, more or less, are already open for tourism. Let me start.
Sharad, are you there?
Yes, I'm there. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, now we can hear you. Did you hear my question or
Absolutely.
should I repeat?
I heard your question.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right.
Okay. To answer your question, the lesser known parks, let me begin with something like Sanjay Duvri National Park, which is in central India. Just 110 kilometers from Bandhavgarh, 2 hours drive. That's a beautiful forest, the largest sal forest in central India. It has tigers, it has all the possible wildlife, and it is peaceful. You enter and that whole forest belongs to you. It's that peaceful. You're not really disturbing the wildlife or nature for that matter there. So that's one park. If you come over to north, you can look at Dudhwa National Park. You could look at Pilibhit Tiger Reserve. You could look at Nandhaur Wildlife Sanctuary. And there are more. I mean, Rajaji National Park. If you have to go to Rajasthan, you've got places like Tal Chapar. You have Jorbid. You have Khichen also, of course. Then Gujarat, you have Velavadar, etc. So plenty of places. And there are tigers visible there. I mean, one of my favorite moments in the last 31 years of my wildlife has been in Dudhwa National Park. Not in Kanha, not in Bandhavgarh, not in Corbett, not in Ranthambore. Dudhwa, wherein I was very fortunate to see an encounter between an elephant and a tiger.
Wow.
So now coming back to the infrastructure. There is infrastructure as of now as well, but it is for FITs to begin with. It's not for the groups. All right. Wildlife tourism as such, I think we should keep the groups away, at least the series away. Let's get the ad hoc groups in. No problem. Once in a while, if you have a group, it's good. But for FITs, there is no problem. If you have to go to Dudhwa, there are places to stay. If you go to Pilibhit Tiger Reserve, you have a nice homestay. You also have Surya, who operates a Kafila camp in that area, from Dudhwa to Pilibhit to Corbett, etc. So that whole belt is so beautiful. So there are these parks which are absolutely untouched. They are peaceful. And I think it's time that we start looking at them in a bigger way. And they have all the wildlife. They have all the wildlife. It's just that because people are not visiting them yet, so we do not get reports and of sightings, and we don't see the photographs of Dudhwa or photographs of Pilibhit coming on Facebook. So we think that nothing exists beyond Kanha, Bandhavgarh, Ranthambore, Corbett, etc. There are plenty of places in the country. I mean, with close to 110 national parks, more than 550 wildlife sanctuaries, I think we don't have a dearth of wilderness in this country. It's just that we have to be willing to take a risk. And that is where, the role of the tour operator comes to begin with. Also the hoteliers
Well
to
said.
invest, and also the hoteliers to invest that kind of money, or if not big money, I mean, you don't need to spend money in building huge lodges like the place that Eric has in Kanha, just about 8 rooms, beautiful, those kind of setups. If were to come up, or like what Surya is doing with the camps, brilliant. So plenty of places. I think we should start focusing on those parks. Tigers there also need attention. They are as beautiful. The parks are perhaps even prettier. If you were to look at Dudhwa, it has the tiger, it has the elephant, it has the rhinos, it has the ghadials, it has the crocodiles, it has the lesser floricans, it has Bengal floricans, it has the otters, it has over 550 species of birds. What more?
Wow.
Which other park in the country? Such a combination, So there are plenty of places. Have I answered your question?
Very well, Sharad. So it gives us a whole range of opportunities there. My next question, we'll hold that thought, and I think a lot of us will have, I mean, this is something to take away with us. May I request everybody to mute your mics if you are not speaking, so that there are no echoes and simultaneous sounds that keep coming up. And we will have a relatively quieter discussion then. Bhavna, my next question is to you. We have seen an increase in women being employed as forest rangers in the country. Gir Park and Tadoba are leading the example. How do you think this affects the dynamics in the conservation of wildlife and education of indigenous tribes living within and around the national reserves and national parks?
Right. So very interesting question, Lovely. In fact, I'll again be speaking about my area where I work. I work in Kanha. Of course, Tadoba and Gir are brilliant examples of women leading from the front. But I have had the opportunity to work with women guards in Kanha. So we run a program called Nature Education Camp with the Forest Department, where it's an all women team. So me, my director, there are 2 forest guards called Lakshmi and Seema. We're all women. And the most beautiful thing is that even villagers or communities are very comfortable when women come into their houses. The men in the village are more comfortable if women come and talk to them about awareness, about what challenges villagers face. So that helps the wildlife dynamic in a very positive way. Secondly, when other children, when they come to camps, when we meet with them in the villages, other girls, other boys, especially the girls, they see these forest guards working away from their families and doing such a great job to protect the forest. Even they feel very passionately about joining the department. I've had about almost 10-15 girls come to me almost every camp, and they want to become a forest guard, which is brilliant, which is beautiful. And because they see that these women they're safe, they're protecting the forest, they're getting the accolades, they're getting the recognition, and the families are supporting them. So it's great. And in fact, one of my Pardi kids in Panna, she saw forest guard and she said, you know what, I may not be a forest guard, but I want to become a police officer. And she's from a traditional hunting community, and they used to be extremely scared of authority like police once upon a time. But she says, I want to be a police officer once I finish my education, which is a huge success story for us. But I think that stems from the fact that more and more women are joining this field as guards. So yeah, that helps the dynamics a lot.
Brilliant. That's so nice to hear this aspect of wildlife tourism.
Yeah.
Surya, I have a question for you now. You have experience of both wildlife in both in India and Africa. What, according to you, is the major difference in operating of these tours in the 2 countries? Largely Africa and India, and it would be great to get your perspective on areas where you think India needs to learn from Africa, and on which aspect she needs to improve her image as a wildlife destination.
Well, firstly, we have to remember that wildlife tourism in Africa was started much earlier than India. And to be very honest, there is a huge gap in terms of the approach towards tourism. Of course, there is a practical difficulty in applying the same principles of Africa here, because you're talking about very different cultures, very different landscapes where wildlife tourism happens. And when you take Africa as such, it's very hard to compare with India, both of which are huge countries and huge continents or huge land masses where you have multiple different kinds of tourism happening. Like you have the coast in Africa, you have coast in India, you have deserts, you have savanna, you have rainforest, you have both in both the places. But having said that, one major difference I find between Africa and India is they, in Africa overall, in my experience of Namibia, Zambia, Tanzania, Kenya, and Zimbabwe, I feel they are more open to the idea of tourism. So when a government over there is more open to the idea of tourism, and like how Eric was mentioning, the 20% and the restrictiveness and the whole buffer zone concepts and the park concepts, there it kind of blends in to a much more beautiful mosaic where you have communities which are involved in tourism almost to 100%, and you have a very good structure where people become guides and rangers. There is levels of exams that they need to clear, and they have to review it year after year, and it is recognized by the government over there. So there is a whole lot more will from the governments in Africa where tourism is popular for inviting people and to set up something that works wonders over there for them, because they have conservancies, they have leased camps which pay a good amount of money to be inside the park, giving a great experience to guests. They have camps which have designated walking areas where the locals take them out on foot tracking expeditions, and not always you see big wildlife, but they bring out the beauty in an antlion or a moth or a beetle. I mean, you have that multitude of experiences in Africa. And in India, it is happening, but what I feel is it's happening to a large extent because of individuals like Sharad, who wants to promote one area, or Eric, who knows another area well. Eric may showcase the birds when another person may not know the birds. So there is a whole lot of disparity there is a lack of consistency in India, which you can be sure that in Africa, if you pay a certain amount of money, even if it's a last minute, there is going to be some amount of accommodation for you to go in, find a lodge, and do your safaris. But because of this restrictive policy in India, as someone who has worked in lodges in central India, I feel that for someone who's coming in, there's a whole lot of planning to make sure you can get into the park. You know, there's about 4 months or 5 months before you need to get your tickets, and the lodge has to make sure in all these remote areas that you can get the tickets on time before the tickets are sold out. So there is a whole lot of tension, I would say, in India, which is not there in Africa. I would put it that way. I mean, again, I cannot carpet bomb India and Africa. There are a lot of good examples in India. There are a lot of bad examples in Africa, which I've witnessed myself. But overall, this is the feel. I mean, their GDP is hugely contributed by tourism because of how they run it. And India can also be the same, but unfortunately, we are not putting in that much of trust in wildlife tourism to be a great conservation tool, though it has proven multiple times in the past that it can do it. So that is something I feel is the disparity between Africa and India for now.
And also our parks are nationalized and they are government controlled, whereas in Africa, the parks are more private.
No, not necessarily. You have government parks in Africa also. You have conservancies which have been leased out or bought over by private people. But there is checks and tabs on them by the government. Everyone has strict SOPs which they have to follow. And if in case some of their SOPs are broken, the government has the right to break their lease anytime. So there is a procedure there is a method to the madness over there. And there were a lot of meetings in Bhopal, which I attended, where the same principles were thought of for the territorial forests and the buffer zones in India. But for some reason, it never took off. I'm not sure why, but it never took off. Like me personally, or our company, what me and Hashim have decided, is that we are going to work mostly in lesser known parks, which Sharad was talking about also, and also work in non-protected areas where there is no forest department, no government control, just community land, so that you involve the community in protecting the wildlife in their backyard. The guests come and stay with them. They provide the experience, we provide the training, and the whole thing becomes like a smooth mosaic where you have the freedom to do what you want. within the limits of ethical guidelines, and you have a nicer experience, and the benefit is you're protecting wildlife in an area which in the past did not get any kind of protection or legal protection from the government. So we found that model works for us. We have a lot less tension that way. But having said that, yes, there is work to be done. It can be done. We're not far from it, but it just requires the will.
I've had the opportunity to stay in one of your Kafila camps, Surya, in Kalinjar actually. It was beautiful experience, and I think the way you involve the community is quite commendable. So it's really rare and off the beat, as offbeat as it can be. So I think you spoke about the different types of parks in Africa. Even in India, we have a whole range of different national parks, and each one has its own USP. It's just that the awareness is not there. So related to that, my next question would be to Jean. Jean, you have had the opportunity to visit the national parks in central India, which are largely the more popular ones. And also you have been to Maharashtra, Tadoba, I think. So based on your observation, what difference do you see in these parks? Jean?
He's mute.
Excuse me, I was muted.
Okay.
So, no, I was saying that, yes, my experience in terms of national parks in Maharashtra is limited because I only experimented Tadoba. But overall, in my experience is that I did not see that much of differences in terms of organizations between Tadoba in Maharashtra and Madhya Pradesh parks. Despite few details such as the weekly day of closure and that the fact in Tadoba alcohol is banned. But I just would like to point out the way it is organized in central India compared with some other parks in other sides of India is the way the naturalist is put in the organization. In these national parks, you do the safari accompanied with the naturalist of the property you sleep in, which is extremely important because there is a kind of control in the quality of the naturalist, which is extremely important for me. Why? Because this is also about sustainability for me. It is sustainability is also to the capacity to make our traveler aware of the environment where he is at a certain day. And if you have a naturalist which is passionate, he will make sure, in fact, that you are aware of the environment, not only about wildlife, but also about the local culture. It's not only about seeing tigers. Tiger sighting in the wild is a matter of chance. And if you don't have a naturalist which is capable to show you other stuffs, to tell you stories behind each and every animal or bird spotted, then you can be disappointed. As far as my experience is concerned, my best souvenir is more about the safari I had with a certain naturalist rather than the comfort of the hotel where I lived. And I think this point is important to highlight because it's not obvious for those who have never attended any safaris, and also to highlight the difference with some other parks such as Ranthambore, for instance, which is maybe the most popular one in India, because conveniently located in between very important places such as Jaipur, Agra, and Delhi. And I think it is important to showcase. It is not in all the parks that you have a naturalist which is private and which is handled by the property you sleep in. And more than a naturalist, in fact, he becomes almost a friend because he will be with you also in the property. In between two safaris, the naturalist will be roaming around in the property, make sure that you are comfortable, and he will have time enough to understand your profile and to have time to speak about something else, but only tiger or only wildlife. So this is where the choice of the accommodation also is extremely important because the quality of the naturally that you will have will go a long ways. And I think us as a DMC, it is our role as well not to speak only about the accommodation that we provide to our traveler, but also to speak about the naturalist that goes behind. I think this is also sustainable to promote also that point.
Very, very valid point, Jean. It's like in a regular tour, a guide can make or break a journey. In the same way, a good naturalist can make or mar your experience in a wildlife park. So it's very important to have somebody knowledgeable and who speaks well with you when you're in the park. So thank you for that important point there. I'll come to Surya. I'll come back to you now, Surya. So you are in the south right now. So Jean was talking about the parks in central India, how organized they are and how well they function. South Indian national parks are equally, if not richer in density of wildlife, flora, and lesser fauna. However, they still lag behind compared to their Central Indian counterparts. What do you think is the reason, and what can be done to boost the South Indian wildlife parks?
Well, I mean, Loveleen, that's something I think about almost every day because I am from the south, but I don't think I'll ever work here. It's coming back to the same answer that I gave for the comparison between India and Africa. It is again down to government will. Like we have a difference of thought process between India and Africa. It is very similar. The difference of thought process between Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, and Uttarakhand and Rajasthan. There's a huge gap between how they think and how states like Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, which do have the major parks of South India, think. Because at least the safari parks, they, for some reason, do not want to bring in the tried and tested systems which exist in North India and Central India. And they still want to keep the parks as something which is not for tourism. So there is a difference in the way they operate and the whole approach of the forest department top down in Tamil Nadu. That's where I'm from. But if you look at Karnataka, it is the total opposite, where the government wants complete control. And what Jean was mentioning about the naturalist, that whole concept is lost in translation because the government has total control in parks like Karnataka, and their intent is entirely to fill up their lodges and their vehicles taking them in so that all the money goes into the government. There are private people who are fighting the case and there are good lodges, but unfortunately they all have to send their guests to the government lodge for the safaris. But having said that, some of those parks are still doing well because of, like you said, the richness of the wildlife. I mean, you have like Sharad was mentioning about Dudhwa, except the rhino, you have almost everything. You have elephants, gaur, leopards, and the recent, the tigers, of course, and the recent black panther, which has been doing the rounds in Kabini, and it's probably the most sought after cat in the world. So people are trying to take a blind eye to the system that is running the tourism there, simply because they want to see the black panther. So I'm hoping at some point the flaws do show up and they do come across to Madhya Pradesh and learn from their systems and apply that here. The one state in South India which actually does a fantastic job, but unfortunately it's not recognized as much because it doesn't involve big cats, is Kerala. Kerala is fantastic in the way they run their tourism, like how Bhavana does in Kana and Panna. Parks like Periyar have converted ex-poachers into fantastic park guides who take you on the most brilliant walks. I don't know, for somewhere in between, they've also been taught English, like fantastic English. And they take you on these walks to show you grasses and flowers and butterflies and birds. So they show you all of that. And the Periyar gives you an option to do bamboo rafting. They have opened up some of their forest rest houses for people to walk in the evening, stay the night, and come back in the morning. So there's a whole lot of things happening in the south, especially in Kerala. But unfortunately, we don't hear much about them in the mainframe of wilderness tourism simply because it doesn't involve big cats. So Kerala is doing a good job. They have a lot of nature trails open. Their different parks offer a variety of experiences. And one thing about the south in terms of wilderness tourism is a lot of private parties hold large pieces of land in South India, like tea estates, coffee estates, cardamom estates, and some people even own private forests. Like Fringe Ford in Wayanad, which is one of my favorite properties in the country, he owns about 540 acres of rainforest. And what he does in his space is probably uncomparable to anything I've experienced in India. But it is not under the mainstream of what we talk about wildlife tourism in India, because it doesn't involve big cats. So there's a lot of individual people doing good work. Kerala is doing good work. I don't know what Andhra and Telangana are doing because they're still sorting out their state split. But Karnataka, yes, it takes it to the other extreme of monopoly over tourism. Tamil Nadu, I don't think they want tourism. So this is there's a whole lot of disparity in the thought process of the individual forest departments. So it comes down to the same as what my answer was to the previous question you asked about India and Africa. It is just the difference in thought processes and policy that is forming these walls or barricades to progress in conservation-oriented tourism.
But from a client perspective, the opportunity that is there, the diversity that one gets to see in the South is massive. I remember doing a night walk in Periyar. I don't know if they still do it, but the night walk in Periyar was beautiful with, as you said, one of those locals who led the walk. They were talking about grass and flowers and birds, and I mean, tiger was nowhere in the picture, but it was a beautiful experience.
The night walk in Periyar is one of the must-do things. In fact, recently what I've been doing is I do some of my tours to South India, but I avoid, like I told you, most of the major parks. So I go to a plantation in Valparai just to look at Nilgiri Thar and lion-tail macaques. And then I go to a small sanctuary called Chinnar to look for the endemic grizzle squirrel. And then you go to Munnar to go to the cardamom estates there to look for birds and to look for certain wildlife over there. And then you go down to a bird sanctuary in Kerala where we can just do walks all day. So I try to take people through different habitats, but most of it are one of these exceptional parks which allow tourism or private land. So that's how I like to do it. And the experience is fantastic. And for those who want big cats, of course, we add in a kabini at the end for the lack of a better option. But it works wonders to do a tour like that because it's something totally different to what you experience in Central India. The amount of life, as you mentioned, is many-fold higher than what you would experience in another, let's say, a deciduous forest, because most of this is evergreen forest, which we cover here. And it's been great. I haven't had any problems yet, and the experience is great. And that's personally what I do every monsoon in South India when I get a chance to drive around. So it is like taking people through my backyard. But as an overall perspective, there is a lot of scope. There is a lot to explore. There is a lot to learn. There is a lot to enjoy in South India in terms of wilderness. There is a lot of conservation-oriented tourism which can be brought in here. But for all of that to start, there has to be a consistent lobby against this archaic policy that's running our states.
Right. Well, on that note, I have a fun question from Sharad to Sharad. Sharad, as a naturalist yourself, and especially in a park like Ranthambore, does it frustrate you when visitors are disappointed for not spotting a tiger, despite your efforts to enthuse them about the other incredible fauna and whatever other species that you see? How do you help them get over their disappointment and make them feel like the safari was a success?
I think the whole process starts before the safari. You got to prepare them. You have to prepare them. You have to talk to them. You have to tell them that it's a beautiful national park. There is so much more. Of course, if their focus is tiger, and if they don't see, they will be disappointed. I mean, that's the truth, brutal truth. And if I don't see a tiger, I will also be disappointed. There's nothing called as, yes, I've seen tiger thousands of times, and I'm okay with it. No, I will be disappointed, definitely. So how you prepare the guest? You start talking to him about, like Jim Corbett, the famous legendary author, the conservationist, etc. He writes in his book that, you can see the tiger only when the tiger wants himself to be shown. You can see him only if tiger wants. So if you start talking to him on those terms, then yes, that it's not very easy to spot a tiger in India. The terrain is such, whether it is Ranthambore, whether it is Corbett, there are areas where the tiger could be just 3 meters away from you and you will not sight him. Then you start also, later telling him, if you don't spot a tiger, that yes, you haven't seen a tiger, but the tiger has definitely seen you. So there are ways you engage him, you keep him light. There are times, there are risks that you take, and you have to also tell them, not to be disappointed. Yes, they will be disappointed if they don't, but in a national park in India, anything can happen in a split of a second. Nothing going on right for 3.5 hours, and one tiger sighting for less than a minute, and you got it right. So even if the guest is getting disappointed, you should not be. Your eyes still should be looking around. You should still be positive, still keep them engaged, keep them motivated. But yes, if you don't see, one does get dissatisfied, definitely. But the chances of not seeing a tiger are very, very less, very, very remote in any of the national park now. You have to calculate, you have to see how many nights a guest is going to the national park, how many safaris is he doing, which zone is he going into, which resort is he staying in, who's the naturalist who's going with him. So there are a whole lot of factors that you keep in mind, and you increase your luck by increasing the number of safaris that you do in a national park. So if you're just doing a 2-night stay in Ranthambore, then your chances are definitely less. There are higher chances of getting disappointed, especially if you happen to be getting zone 7, 8, 9, 10, something like that. And you can not always get in between zone 1 to 5. So you have to give yourself more number of days. You have to see what is the intensity of the guest. How desperate is he to see a tiger? If that is the case, then do not give him only one national park. Give him more than one. Give him more number of nights. So eventually he will not be. And lately, last few years, the tiger sightings have considerably improved. So we've not encountered a case that you don't see a tiger lately.
Loveleen, you are mute.
Sorry.
You are muted.
Yeah, Loveleen is mute. Okay.
Yeah, I forget. Tell everybody else, and I forget it. So there are a whole lot of combinations that kind of help you get to the right track. And has the government relaxed rules with regard to zones in Ranthambore? There used to be that full day thing that you can do now. Is that still there? Could you tell us a little bit about that to our audience? There might be people in the audience who are not aware of that rule that you can pay extra and do a full day and go to any zone, etc.
There are, let me just begin by saying that wildlife is a state subject. All right. So any national park can decide, or any state can decide whatever policies. At times, they even change the policy within the season as well. All right. So there was a time when in Ranthambore, you do a full day safari, no problem. You start from this area, you can go to any zone. And suddenly, a couple of months down the line, within the season, they said, no, you will have to come out, and then you'll have to go to the other zone, etc. So yes, it is there. Full day safari is there, but every season you have to watch out for it. You have to be in touch with the forest department to know as to what is going on, whether the same rules as last year will apply or not. Even in central India, there was a time when they said that if you have to do a full day safari, say in Bandhavgarh, you could have entered from Tala and exited from Magdi and then entered Khitauli. But no, I mean, after entering from Tala, you'll have to come out from Tala, then go into Magdi, then come out of Magdi, get back into Tala. That was wasting more than an hour. So there are these policies which keep changing. So you have to keep yourself abreast. So if I tell you something today, tomorrow it might not be applicable, and you will say, Sharad ne bola tha. So yeah, so we need to keep on. We have to update ourselves very regularly what's happening in the national parks.
Okay. Yeah, all right. A point taken. So I'll ask Eric now. So Eric, what do you think of the parks in the Northeast? Do you think they deserve a much better place in the scheme of things in the wildlife map of India?
Absolutely. I think the diversity which they have in the Northeast is just breathtaking, amazing. The number of cats, the different cat species that they have. I'm not talking about the lion or the snow leopard, but the other cats, number of species, it's just amazing. But let me make one point very clear here. I'm sure Sharad also will agree with me. In the last 5-10 years, we have seen, the number of lodges that are that have come up in the last 10 years around Kana or Bandhavgarh, Pench, not so much in Satpura. I think we need to be a little more sensitive about it, because more lodges, more than what the park buffer zone can sustain. There are several things here, creating that much garbage, adding plastic, and also drawing groundwater. We need so much of groundwater to run these lodges. I think even in the Northeast, I mean, if they are thinking of promoting, the government should have some policies to restrict the number of lodges and also to restrict the number of rooms. I think you should not have huge properties around national parks. There are places where there are 30, 40, 50 rooms around the national parks. It's like an eyesore. I mean, within a short span of 5 to 10 years, a beautiful spot at the entrance of the park would look like some little township with number of dabas, number of lodges, number of cars and taxis waiting. I think that's not the scenario you want to create for a wildlife park. I mean, the accommodation should be limited and the lodges should be small. And before you permit a lodge to come up, you should evaluate, and you have to do an environmental impact assessment and see how many lodges your national park or sanctuary can actually accommodate. Otherwise, once again, it will become the same Kishri like how we used to have 300 cars in Kana one single day. I think we have to restrict the number of tourists and number of lodges in the long run. And yes, Northeast also has some stunning, areas, beautiful forests, amazing, wildlife, even birds, butterflies, snakes, frogs. I mean, it's just another. You're going to a different zone altogether. From if you go from Central India to Northeast, it's a completely different habitat. So there is immense scope in Northeast as well.
Thank you, Eric. So we are almost nearing the end of our time, but I'll do one last round of questions, and I think that would be a wrap-up round, and then we'll take on questions. Beyond the tiger, what do you see? This is my question to all the panelists, and I'll start with Jean. First of all, Jean, what do you think people expect to see in India, other than the tiger, when they come for wildlife tourism?
In fact, there are different kind of profile of travelers doing safaris. You have, we were speaking about Ranthambore. I think in Ranthambore, the number of people not being aware at all of wildlife and safari and what are the do's and don't in the wildlife world is quite huge. And to have myself experimented several safaris in Ranthambore, I know that people on the ground, I think, suffer of a huge pressure on each and every safaris to showcase tiger. And I myself once accompanied agents in Ranthambore. So for them, I was myself kind of the naturalist, and I could feel the pressure the whole safari. So for these one, there is unfortunately only tiger to see. Then this is where we have to create awareness and to inform them, not only the day when they reach Ranthambore, but even from their house, or when they speak with their agent in the travel agency, because the earlier you inform your traveler, the better he will be prepared. I think Periyar is for that a very good example. For many years, we had so many people coming back from Periyar very disappointed because they thought they would see a tiger. And now that we have created more awareness about the fact that, okay, please hold on, you might not see any tigers, but you will do this, this, and this, and it's also a question of environment. The number of good comments that we have been receiving is much more. Then from a pure wildlife list perspective, I think all our experts there will be better positioned than me to reply. But Behind the Bengal tiger, you have the Indian leopards as well, even if it is much more shy, so more difficult to spot. You have the gores. You have also the blue bulls, which personally I felt very, very happy when I saw it. And of course, all this birds world, which I think, unless in the bird lovers world, of course, is quite a surprise to see the diversity of bird that you can see in all Indian national parks is quite huge. So there is a big difference again between what our travelers expect to see according to the national park and what they really get to see.
Interesting. Thank you, Jean, for that insight. Eric, I'll come back to you now. So tell us something about the endangered reptilian species in India. I mean, is there an opportunity to promote that kind of very specific tourism?
Well, lovely when you ask this question. A single place that comes to my mind is in Karnataka, which is also known as the King Cobra capital, Agumbe. Now, Agumbe is the Agumbe Rainforest Research Station, which was started long back by Romulus Whitaker himself, and now he has his own team there working there, and their single mission is to create awareness about snakes, especially the King Cobra. And the whole belt is, of course, it's very rich in wildlife. The single, objective is to save the King Cobra from being persecuted. Now, it's a great success story, and people can actually go and stay there in small groups. Of course, it's not a great place in terms of luxuries. They got basic accommodation. I visited in 2019 during the rainy season. They rescue the king cobras and they release them, and they have been able to create tremendous awareness in the whole belt. And it's hats off to them, the way the whole team is so dedicated. And any time of the day or night, they are ready to, the moment they receive a call from some estate or from from a field or from a farmer's house, because king cobras roam freely there, they go and rescue them, and they are doing a commendable job. And if one has to learn about reptiles, I would strongly suggest go and stay there. I mean, they also conduct these herping walks in the night with flashlights. You can identify different species of snakes. Sometimes in one night you see 50, 60 different species of snakes. Wow. So it's an amazing experience. And also, they educate people and help in conserving reptiles there.
Thank you, Eric. Surya, tell us something about your encounters with the snow leopard in Ladakh.
I worked in Central India for 8 years, 7.5 years to be exact, before I got a call saying, would you like to work with snow leopards? And I probably never imagined that I'll ever get a chance to see these cats. I open the field guide and I see them and I just ignore that page because I know I'll never get to see one. And suddenly I was there running a camp which was hosting people who came to see snow leopards. So it was a huge shift in a matter of 3 or 4 months. And it took a lot of learning. I had to understand the place. I had to understand the treeless forest. It was just rocks and snow. But it was quite exciting. I mean, I've seen a lot of snow leopards in my last 3.5 years there. But I'll probably take you back to the first one I saw. I was there for 3 months by myself, just walking around these mountains, trying to understand how they move, what they feed on, how to find the prey, how to find the predators, how to find signs. And I found all of that except the snow leopard because I was by myself. So it took 3 months. I found a lot of scat. I found some tracks. I saw ibex. I saw blue sheep. I saw the bird. but I didn't see a snow leopard. And finally, one of the villagers one day felt pity on me, and he is one of our spotters. And he said, I'll come with you this evening. And I was like, okay. I had pretty much lost hope by then because they were all around, but I couldn't even find one. And then I spent about half an hour with him, and we sat on our scope with a cup of chai outside his house. And he started scanning the mountains in front of his house. And within, I would say, roughly about 10 to 12 minutes, we found our first family of snow leopards on a high ridge. And they were right there for the last 3 months, maybe. I mean, I had no idea, but I didn't see them. And he found this first 3 snow leopards for me. And while I was watching them, he said there's something moving on the opposite ridge. And then I looked over this side and there was another mother with 2 cubs. So my first snow leopard turned out to be my first 6 snow leopards. And I was there at the very same place without help for 3 months. And that's how it went. So it goes to show what local knowledge actually how much it means for a person to go to a place. Like, for example, even Kana, at some point when someone went new before the books were written, it was the Baigas who would have helped the people find these animals, the tigers, and take them to different parts of the forest, which they knew for generations. And that's how it was for the snow leopard. I mean, it was beautiful. I could feel all the hair rising, and it was like a moment of excitement. I was running around and hugging people. All of that was great, but later when you reflect on the evening, what it was beautiful to think that here I was thinking I was a naturalist, working in forests 8 years, taking guests out and showing them great wildlife. And I had to like literally go down to this local chap who didn't know the birds, who didn't know the signs, but he had the eyes for the place. And that's what really mattered. It was beautiful. I mean, I'll never forget my first snow leopard.
Thank you, Surya. My last question is to Sharad. Sharad, we've had some celebrity tigers in India, like the famous Machli.
Yeah.
Tell us something interesting about her or any other celebrity tiger you've encountered. And then we'll end the session then.
So India, I think every tiger is legendary, but yes, some tigers become more popular because of social media, and every tiger has a different story. I've been fortunate over the last 3 decades in seeing some real big tigers as well, and legendary tigers. If it comes to Central India, to begin with Banka, Charger, Sita, B2, B1, B3, Mohini, etc. Kanha also, Munna's father, and now the current generation. And prior to that, Lakshmi. In Ranthambore, T24, popularly known as Ustad, and then Machli, of course. So these are tigers from whom you actually learn a lot. You know, even in Corbett, you have a lot of tigers like that. So plenty of experiences. So I'm coming out with a book which should be hopefully out by end of this year, which is basically about what all things to learn from tigers. You know, so it is not a coffee table book. It's not a photographic book. It's on things to learn from tigers. It should be out by end of the year, and that will cover a lot of things about my personal experiences also. So if you want to hear a personal experience, I've had many, but I think the most there are different types of tiger sightings. Let's start with that way. I think one is a general tiger sighting that you would see a tiger cross by you. Then there is a tiger sighting where you see a tiger with cubs, tigress with cubs. You might also end up seeing tigers mating. You might, if you're lucky, you would see a tiger in fight. You know, tigers fighting, territorial fight. But one sighting that you don't want to see is a tiger charging at you. And I've had some experiences there, and one is bound to have those experiences, especially in lesser known parks where the tigers are not used to tourism. So tigers getting close because they're not used to tourism, though we maintain a distance. So some experiences like that, that will take a long time once I'll get into storytelling. But yeah, it's have had some amazing experiences with it. And
wow.
and I just want to, if this is my last question, just one final thing I would like to say that tiger is a charismatic species, and that's not his fault. All right. People come to see the tiger. 99% of people come to see tigers in India. That is the best way to attract eyeballs. That's the best way to get funds. That's the best way to increase awareness. Yeah. So once you do that, once guest falls in love with the Indian wilderness experience because of the tiger, Then you tell him, yes, we've got the snow leopard, we've got the one-horned rhinos, we've got the black panther, we've got 1,300 species of birds, we've got crocodiles, we've got the king cobras, whatnot. Then it becomes easy. It's like today, if you have to introduce somebody to cricket, it's easier done through IPL rather than a test match. You know, so that is what it is. So tiger, whether we like it or not, is a huge catch. And yes, there are other equally beautiful species which don't get as much attention. But as Surya said right in the beginning, you know, tiger is our megafauna. Tiger is the umbrella species under which we protect everything. So let's respect that. People come to see Taj Mahal in India. You know, Agrasen Ki Bawdi is not on top of the list.
Yeah,
it's a beautiful monument. I mean, somebody who enjoys monuments and architecture will love it. But Taj Mahal is the focus. So that's how it is.
Thank you. On those happy golden notes, ladies and gentlemen, we will end the session and thank you all the panelists for being there. We will open up now for Q&A just for maybe 10 minutes because we have really overrun. Just want to tell everybody that for your reference, we have a detailed guide on the national parks in India. And it talks about rules and regulations, and it talks about all the types of flora and fauna found in these parks. So it's a huge compilation that we have done at the Destination Knowledge Center, and it's available with us. And that's why we didn't get into the nitty-gritties of types of national parks, etc. This discussion was largely to encourage you to start selling wildlife in India, and if tiger be the focus, so be it. So thank you everybody. The floor is now open for Q&A.